Section 7: Reconstruction and the West. The end of the Civil War brought new violence to the West, as the United States devoted increased resources toward dispossessing indigenous people. Groups like the Utes and Paiutes were pushed out of the Rocky Mountains by U.S. expansion into Colorado and away from the northern Great Basin by the expanding Mormon population in Utah Territory in the 1850s and 1860s. Faced with a shrinking territorial base, members of these two groups often joined the U.S. military in its campaigns in the Southwest against other powerful native groups like the Hopi, the Zuni, the Jicarilla Apache, and especially the Navajo, whose population of at least 10,000 engaged in both farming and sheep herding on some of the most valuable lands acquired by the United States after the Mexican War. Conflicts between the U.S. military, American settlers, and native nations increased throughout the 1850s. By 1862, General James Carleton began searching for a reservation where he could remove the Navajo and end their threat to U.S. expansion in the Southwest. Carleton selected a dry, almost treeless site in the Bosque Redondo Valley, 300 miles from the Navajo homeland. In April 1863, Carleton gave orders to Colonel Kit Carson to round up the entire Navajo population and escort them to Bosque Redondo. Those who resisted would be shot. Thus began a period of Navajo history called the Long Walk, which remains deeply important to Navajo people today. The Long Walk was not a single event, but a series of forced marches to the reservation at Bosque Redondo between August 1863 and December 1866. Conditions at Bosque Redondo were horrible. Provisions provided by the U.S. Army were not only inadequate but often spoiled. Disease was rampant, and thousands of Navajos died. By 1868, it had become clear that life at the reservation was unsustainable. General William Tecumseh Sherman visited the reservation and wrote of the inhumane situation in which the Navajo were essentially kept as prisoners, but the lack of cost-effectiveness was the main reason Sherman recommended that the Navajo be returned to their homeland in the West. On June 1, 1868, the Navajo signed the Treaty of Bosque Redondo, an unprecedented treaty in the history of U.S. Native relations, in which the Navajo were able to return from the reservation to their homeland. The treaties that had been signed with numerous Native nations in California in the 1850s were never ratified by the Senate. Over 100 distinct Native groups lived in California before the Spanish and American conquests, but by 1880, the Native population of California had collapsed from about 150,000 on the eve of the gold rush to a little less than 20,000. A few reservation areas were eventually set up by the U.S. government to collect what remained of the Native population, but most were dispersed throughout California. This was partly the result of state laws from the 1850s that allowed white Californians to obtain both Native children and adults as apprentice laborers by merely bringing the desired laborer before a judge and promising to feed, clothe, and eventually release them after a period of service that ranged from 10 to 20 years. Thousands of California's natives were thus pressed into a form of slave labor that supported the growing mining, agricultural, railroad, and cattle industries. As settler incursions continued to provoke conflict, Americans pushed for a new peace policy. Congress, confronted with these tragedies and further violence, authorized in 1868 the creation of an Indian Peace Commission. The commission's study of Native Americans decried prior American policy and galvanized support for reformers. After the inauguration of Ulysses S. Grant the following spring, Congress allied with prominent philanthropists to create the Board of Indian Commissioners, a permanent advisory body to oversee indigenous affairs and prevent the further outbreak of violence. The board effectively Christianized American Indian policy. Much of the reservation system was handed over to Protestant churches, which were tasked with finding agents and missionaries to manage reservation life. Congress hoped that religiously minded men might fare better at creating just assimilation policies and persuading Native Americans to accept them. Historian Francis Paul Prucha believed that this attempt at a new peace policy might just have properly been labeled the religious policy. Many female Christian missionaries played a central role in cultural re-education programs that attempted to not only instill Protestant religion, but also impose traditional American gender roles and family structures. They endeavored to replace indigenous peoples' tribal social units with small patriarchal households. Women's labor became a contentious issue because few tribes divided labor according to the gender norms of middle and upper-class Americans. Field work, the traditional domain of white males, was primarily performed by Native women, who also usually controlled the products of their labor, if not the land that was worked, giving them status in society as laborers and food providers. For missionaries, the goal was to get Native women to leave the fields and engage in more proper women's workhouse work. Christian missionaries performed much as secular federal agents had. Few American agents could meet Native Americans on their own terms. Most Americans viewed indigenous peoples on reservations as lazy and thought of indigenous cultures as inferior to their own. The views of J. L. Broadus, appointed to oversee several small tribes on the Hoopa Valley Reservation in California, are illustrative. In his annual report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for 1875, he wrote, "The great majority of them are idle, listless, careless, and improvident. They seem to take no thought about provision for the future, and many of them would not work at all if they were not compelled to do so. They would rather live upon the roots and acorns gathered by their women than to work for flour and beef." Section 9. The end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction ended when Northerners abandoned the cause of the formerly enslaved and Democrats recaptured Southern politics. Between 1868 and 1877, and especially after the Panic of 1873, economic issues supplanted Reconstruction as the foremost issue on the national agenda. The biggest threat to Republican power in the South had been the violence and intimidation of white Democrats. Only the presence of federal troops in key Southern cities prevented Reconstruction's overthrow. But the United States never committed the personnel required to restore order and guarantee Black Southerners the rights promised by the 14th Amendment. Republicans and Democrats responded to economic uncertainty by retreating from Reconstruction. War-weary from a decade of military and political strife, so-called stalwart Republicans turned from the idealism of civil rights to the practicality of economics and party politics. They won particular influence during Ulysses S. Grant's first term as president, 1868-1872. By the early 1870s, stalwart Republicans assumed control of Republican Party politics. Meanwhile, New Departure Democrats who focused on business, economics, political corruption, and trade gained strength by distancing themselves from pro-slavery Democrats and Copperheads. In the South, they were called Redeemers. White Southerners initially opposed the Redeemers and instead clung tightly to white supremacy and the Confederacy, but between 1869 and 1871, the Redeemers won support from white Southerners by promising local rule by white Democrats rather than Black or white Republicans. By 1871, Redeemers won political control and overthrew Reconstruction in three important states: Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia. In September 1873, Jay Cooke and Company declared bankruptcy, resulting in bank runs and closures that spiraled into a 6-year depression. The Panic of 1873 crushed the nation's already suffering laboring class and destroyed whatever remaining idealism Northerners had about Reconstruction. In the South, where many farms were capitalized entirely through loans, sources of credit vanished. Many landowners defaulted and farmers entered an already oversaturated labor market. Wages plummeted and a growing system of debt peonage trapped workers in endless cycles of poverty. The economic turmoil enabled the Democrats to take control of the House of Representatives after the 1874 elections, blunting the legislature's capacity to any longer direct Reconstruction. On the eve of the 1876 presidential election, the nation still reeled from depression. Scandals sapped trust in the Grant administration. By 1875, Democrats in Mississippi hatched the Mississippi Plan, a wave of violence designed to intimidate Black activists and suppress Black voters. The state's Republican governor pleaded for federal intervention, but national Republicans ignored the plea. Meanwhile, Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, won a landslide victory in the Ohio gubernatorial election without mentioning Reconstruction, focusing instead on fighting corruption and alcohol abuse and promoting economic recovery. His success made him a potential presidential candidate. The stage was set for an election that would end Reconstruction as a national issue. Republicans chose Rutherford B. Hayes as their nominee. Democrats chose Samuel J. Tilden, who ran on honest politics and home rule in the South. Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina would determine the president. Despite the enduring presence of Reconstruction in those states, white conservatives organized violence and fraud with impunity. With the election results contested, a federal special electoral commission voted along party lines, 8 Republicans for, 7 Democrats against in favor of Hayes. Democrats threatened to boycott Hayes's inauguration. Rival governments arose, claiming to recognize Tilden as the rightfully elected president. Republicans, fearing another sectional crisis, reached out to Democrats. In what became known as the Compromise of 1877, Democrats conceded the presidency to Hayes on the condition that all remaining troops would be removed from the South and the South would receive special economic favors. Hayes was inaugurated in March 1877. In April, the remaining troops were ordered out of the South. The compromise allowed Southern Democrats, no longer fearing reprisal from federal troops or Northern politicians for their flagrant violence and intimidation of black voters, to return to power. After 1877, Republicans no longer had the political capital or political will to intervene in the South in cases of violence and electoral fraud. In certain locations with large populations of African Americans, such as South Carolina, freed people continued to hold some local offices for several years. Yet, with its most revolutionary aims thwarted by 1868, and economic depression and political turmoil taking even its most modest promises off the table by the early 1870s, most of the promises of Reconstruction were unmet. Section 9. Conclusion. Reconstruction in the United States achieved Abraham Lincoln's paramount desire, the restoration of the Union. The war and its aftermath forever ended legal slavery in the United States, but African Americans remained second-class citizens, and women still struggled for full participation in the public life of the United States. The closing of Reconstruction saw North and South reunited behind the imperatives of economic growth and territorial expansion, rather than ensuring the full rights of its citizens. From the ashes of civil war, a new nation faced fresh possibilities while enduring old problems.